So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Doris Bailey. She is a historian who graduated from the University of Illinois, with degrees in sociology and anthropology. She also received her master's from the U of I in public history. She has worked for DNR in the past and has developed the Walk, Hike, Bike, and History tour for them. And she also recently began her time here at the Illinois State Museum. And we're so excited to have her here to talk about this topic that she's done quite a bit of research on. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Doris.
Hello, thank you. Hi, my name is Doris Bailey again. Our program tonight is talking about the race riot, the silence of the race riot. About 65 years after the race riot happened, it's pretty much silent. And we're going to talk about that and talk about some of the people that helped, why the silence took place, as well as some of the people that helped to break that silence after that 65-year period. But before I begin to talk about that, I like to talk about what happened. So what happened? On August the 13th, 1908, a lady by the name of a young white woman by the name of Mabel Hellam said she had been raped and attacked by an African-American man. However, that was not the truth. Mabel Hellam lied. Mabel Hellam had been having an affair with her husband, Earl, who was white also. And her lover was also white. And she and her lover on this particular night had a fight, and she was bruised quite badly. So to account for that, she said she had been raped and attacked by an African-American man. And she reported this to the authorities. So the following day, on August the 14th, the newspaper comes out, and the headline for the newspaper, and the newspaper I'm speaking of is the Illinois State Register. Today is the State Journal Register. But the headlines for that morning's paper, it said, nothing should be, it said, dragged from bed and outraged by Negro. And the term outrage was the term they used to imply that it was a rape. In that article, in that newspaper article, it said, nothing should be spared to catch the black viper and force appropriate punishment. So this is, so although Mabel Hellam made the initial, incited the riot, so did the newspaper of that day, the State Journal Register. And there was others that had sensational newspapers, articles. It was kind of called yellow journalism. But nonetheless, they also incited the riot. So that morning, so Mabel Hellam did report this incident to the authorities. That morning, the authorities went back into Mabel Hellam's neighborhood because they had information that there were a group of African-American men working not too far from Mabel Hellam's home. She lived at 1145 North 5th Street, and a house that these men were working at was 1149. So they went to that home. They had the men, they took the men to Mabel Hellam's home to see if she could identify any of them. She did not. So they were allowed to go back to their work site. Well, one man by the name of George Richardson, he's African-American, upon returning to work, he promptly walked off of the job. I believe he may have left because he knew that something, no good was going to come from this, and he knew he had done nothing wrong. So he walks off of the job. The authorities are alerted that he has walked off of the job. Before he can get on a trolley, we did have trolleys at that time in Springfield. Before he can get upon that trolley, he was arrested and taken to jail. Mabel Hellam and her husband, Earl, were alerted and summoned to come to the jailhouse. And the jailhouse at the time was at 7th and Jefferson. So at that time, Mabel Hellam identified George Richardson as the man who raped and attacked her. Now, so lots of people lots of people gathered at the jailhouse, lots of whites, men, women, and children. And this crowd began to get very hostile, and they began to demand that the sheriff Charles Werner send these men. By the way, there was two men. So George Richardson was arrested for the rape of Maybelle Hallam, in charge with rape and attack of Maybelle Hallam. But there was another man already in jail, African-American man. His name was Joe James. About a month before the race riot happened, a murder took place on North 9th Street here in Springfield. A white man by the name of Clergy Ballard. He was a miner. He also worked as a train engineer at one time. He was murdered. Someone came into the home and he was attacked. And before his passing, he said it was a Black man. So Joe James was near the neighborhood, and they assumed that he was the person that did it. So he was in jail for that crime. So we have both these African-American men in jail, both crimes against whites. And the crowd begins to demand that the sheriff, send these men out. And Sheriff Werner knew he had the legal responsibility to take care of these men, and that no harm would come to them. So he decided to get them out of the jail. And he did this by getting one of our local citizens at the time, Harry Loper, there wasn't a lot of cars, but Harry Loper had one of the fastest cars in town, which was a Doris touring car. So he gets the car, he says he would help. So the sheriff gets these men into the car, and he gets them out of town. And what he wanted them to, he wanted Harry Loper to take these men to Sherman, Illinois, so that they could catch a train and be taken to Bloomington, Illinois, until their trial. So that's what he did. But the crowd heard about this, and they were not happy. They said that when Loper comes back in town, they were going to confront him, and that's what they did. So I won't tell you the whole story about what happened. There's lots to it, and there's always more that we're learning from it. But because of this lie that Maybelle Hallam told, the crowd went to Loper's restaurant, and that's where the riot started. And from there, Springfield was destined for scandal and destruction. Two African-American men were lynched. There were 5 white men that also lost their lives because of Maybelle Hallam's lie. It's suspected that most of those 5 whites were rioters, but that doesn't mean that their lives did not matter, because they did and still do. But they were believed to be rioters. About 40 to 80 homes and businesses, African-American homes and businesses, were destroyed. There was about 107 indictments, men and women. And the indictments were for looting, larceny, rioting, and some were for murder. But no one was ever convicted of the murder of Scott Burton or William Donegan. And so after this, the aftermath of the race riot, I would say about 1912, it began to be silent. I would say the silence began around about 1912. And that was after the claims. It took two years for, about 4 years for the claims to be settled. So after that, for about 65 years or so, there was nothing to be said about the race riot. Very few things were said about the race riot. I will back up just a moment more. The first anniversary of the race riot, the Illinois State Register did make a statement, and they told all about what had happened during the race riot. And near the very last sentence, very last paragraph, they said, after all, the riot had much to do about nothing. Although 7 people lost their lives, they felt that it was much to do about nothing. And I think that their silence showed they wanted to absolve themselves of any wrongdoing and culpability. So I think that's one of the reasons that the State Journal Register or the Illinois State Register went silent. But silence took place around about 1912. So I'm going to share my screen with you all now. And I will say that, lynchings and riots, they're always very heinous acts. The pictures I have are rather graphic. So I just wanted to forewarn you all. Just letting you know. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Give me a second, please. And I do apologize. Let's see here. So here's some of the pictures that we have. So the first picture that you see, and that's rather graphic, but that's actually an actor. This is from a movie called The Great Debaters. Denzel Washington was in this movie, and it was about a college that was debating, a group of African-American college students that were debating a lot of other colleges. Denzel Washington was their coach. Well, on the side, Denzel Washington was helping some of the sharecroppers unionize. Well, the sheriff and the farm owners, they didn't want this. So they asked several of the sharecroppers if they knew anything about it. In the beginning, this man that you see this picture of, he just was regular. He was very handsome, very tall, handsome gentleman, older gentleman. And then the next time you see him, this is the results of beating. And this picture to me really depicts someone that has been brutally attacked and beaten. And the next picture is a picture of Joe James. And although this is a picture of an actor, his beating that he received after being arrested for the murder of clergy Ballard was quite a bit like this. There's one other picture of him, of Joe James, and you can barely recognize his face. And in this picture here, the second picture, if you look closely, like in the shadow, you can see his eye. His eye is almost bulging out. It's like almost out of his socket, and then the other one is still somewhat swollen. So that's Joe James, and he was accused of the murder of clergy Ballard. He really had, he was an intricate part of the race riot as well. The next picture that you see is Maybelle Hellam. Maybelle Hellam is the young white woman that accused George Richardson of attacking and raping her. She was 21 years old at the time. And so she started this, what happened. She, instigated the race riot by telling this lie. And the next picture that you see is of George Richardson. We have 2 pictures here. One is him a little bit younger, probably about 25, 26 years old. In the newspapers at the time, they said that he's a bad character. He had been in prison. And a lot of scholars, including myself, weren't so sure that was true. But I did some research and I found that he had served time in prison for several crimes. And this is a mugshot of him. But if you look at him, the reason I put these 2 pictures side by side, the second picture is him when he was in the Bloomington jail. And it shows these 2 likenesses of him. One's much lighter than the other because Mr. Richardson was a very fair-skinned man, almost white himself. However, in this other, the picture from Bloomington, it shows him much darker. And it's believed that they may have darkened his picture to show him to be what they thought to be a person, a sinister person, much like they did with O.J. Simpson's picture during that case. So that is the man that was accused of the rape and attack of Maybelle Helen. The next picture at the bottom underneath the first picture, that is a picture of a saloon. The tree that's there in front of it was a tree that they hung the first man. His name was Scott Burton. Scott Burton and his family lived across the street on 12th in Madison, just across the street from this here saloon. Well, his daughters, two, 13, 14-year-old girls, young women, they gave an account of what happened. And they said that the mob came into their home and they began to throw bottles at their father. And they said that one of the rioters hit their father in the head with an axe. They were able to escape the home. It was the mother, the two daughters, and his son. So they were able to escape, but they said that was the last time they saw their father alive. And it truly was. So they dragged him across the street and they hung him from this tree. They shot up his body. There was over 40 to 50 gunshot wounds to his body. They did other heinous things to his body. After military arrived, they cut his body from the tree and buried him at Oak Ridge Cemetery. His family never had a funeral. They buried him that very night. That tree that you see there, by the end of the day, and this was on August the 15th. So the lynching took place about 2 a.m. August the 15th. By the end of the day, that tree was a stump. So that's where Scott Burton was lynched. The next picture is a picture of William Donegan. He was the second African-American man that died during the race riot. Mr. Donegan, and I will go back, and Mr. Burton, he was a barber. He was what's called a race man. A race man was a person that was active and an advocate for civil rights for African Americans, and he was involved in politics. So those are some of the reasons they may have targeted Mr. Burton, and he was doing well for himself. So some racial, some economic jealousy was there as well. And the same for Mr. Donegan. Now, Mr. Donegan was very, very wealthy man, and he lived across the street from where our museum sets today. So Spring and Atwoods, he lived directly across the street. Mr. Donegan was married to a white woman, and the mob went to his home. They demanded he come out. Well, his wife came to the out, and she said that he's not here. Sarah was her name, and she said, he's not here. I'm the only one that's here. And the mob began to threaten her. Mr. Donegan was in the house. He came out to protect his wife. As soon as he came out, the mob grabbed him. He pleaded for his life. He said, have mercy on me, boys, have mercy on me. And someone took a straight razor and they slashed his throat. Dragged him across the street to where our museum is today. There was a schoolhouse there at the time, and they lynched him from a tree on those grounds. So that's William Donegan. The next picture that you see is the aftermath of the race riot. After the smoke cleared, most of the homes and buildings were just shells. This one here is very, it's just one of the pictures that stands out about the race riot. So that was all that was left after the race riot. So lots of 40 to 80 homes and buildings were destroyed. After the race riot, 6 months after the race riot happened, the NAACP was formed not simply because of what happened here, but quite a bit of because of what happened here. But in 1908, there were 100 lynchings, and about 87 of those lynchings were African Americans. So it wasn't just this, what happened here, but it was definitely the catalyst for what happened, for the formation of the NAACP, but not just because of us. But, you know, and we're not, that's nothing to brag on because it's something horrible happened. So those are some pictures I want to show you, but you may ask, why the silence? Why did Springfield go silent or suppress the race riot for over 65 years? Well, blacks and whites had many of the same emotions about the race riot, the silence, when it came to the silence, but for different reasons. I'm gonna stop sharing now. But for, oh, did I mute myself? Can you hear me, Lauren? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can still hear you, Doris.
Oh, okay. So I do apologize. So some of the silence that African Americans had, reasons why they may have been silent, because of fear. Fear was, fear that it could happen again. So we know that in 1908 there were over 100 lynchings. Most of them were people of color, African Americans. From 1882 until 1968, there were 4,742 lynchings. So that fear was real. It wasn't like it's just imagined, it was real, to think that this could happen again. So that was one of their fears. They were silent because it was a way to cope with the fear and grief. And African Americans also felt shame. They shame for the way that they had been treated in such an inhumane way, and there was nothing they could do about it. But not being able to do anything about it didn't mean that they were docile and didn't do anything. My husband's family actually, they lived in a different part. So the race riot took place on the northeast side of town, where lots of African Americans lived. My husband's family lived on the southeast side, and lots of African Americans lived there as well. Well, my husband's mother, she has secondhand information, but she said that her father's family, the men in the neighborhood, went upon their roofs and just kind of watched out to make sure no one came into their neighborhood to harm them. So they did try and defend themselves. They weren't looking for trouble, but if it had come their way, they were ready to protect themselves, their families, and their property. But there's lots of shame there that this happened. So it's just a way for them to cope and get through this, and continue to raise their families, continue to strive for success. So and they just didn't talk about it for all those reasons. Whites in Springfield had some of those same emotions, as I said, but their reasons for being silent or suppressing what happened was a little different. Some of it in the race riot itself happened because of social, economic, and political strides African Americans were making. And whites had a fear of this, feared a change in the status quo. So that was a fear that they had, and to them it was real. They also feared the mere mention of the riots would cast judgment upon Springfield from outsiders and stain Springfield's reputation, as well as the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. And it hasn't been a day since Mr. Lincoln, President Lincoln passed away, that someone has not come here to pay their respects to him. So even in 1908, people were coming to pay their respects to Mr. Lincoln. And if you have this cloud over your city, it doesn't set well with, it kind of smears your reputation and Lincoln's legacy. Many whites denied that the race riot had even taken place, and that was a way to silence the what happened. So it wasn't a riot. It wasn't a riot. One person in particular, circuit judge James A. Creedon, during Joe James's trial, he said it wasn't a riot. It was just a group of cutthroats and lawless men using the George Richardson's case as an excuse for violence. And he said it was not a race riot. But to deny that it was a race riot was another way to silence what happened. And African whites had shame that this had happened as well in their hometown and in the place that they called home. So they did have some shame. It's not something you want to talk about. There's a lot of shame there on both sides. So those are some of the reasons why it was silenced. But 65 years after this happened, some of the silence began to be broken. And I would say that in 1971, that it started to be talked about again. And actually, University of Illinois, at the time it was Sangamon State University, and that started about 1968. 1971, their new professor, Colum Davis, he started a class, and it was a class on oral history. And he said at that time in a newspaper that oral history as a discipline was really becoming popular, had become more popular over the last 15 years at that time. So he formed this here, he started the oral history program. And from 1971 to 1994, they gathered about 33 memoirs from citizens in Springfield and the surrounding area. And when they would do these interviews with some of the people, they would always ask, do you know anything about the race riot? And many of them gave their, recalled what happened. There were 17 African Americans, 15 whites that did the memoirs, and one man of Jewish descent. One of the stories I remember reading when it concerned that has always struck me and kind of saddens me, a man by the name of William Lee. Well, he gave his account, and this was in 1971. And the thing that saddened me most is that his mentality in 1971 was pretty much the same as it was in 1908. And William Lee said that he was one of the rioters. He said he didn't hurt anyone. I threw some rocks and hit some Black people in the head, but I didn't kill anyone. He said that when he was referring to African Americans, he used the N-word. He said that he believed that more people during that race riot died than was accounted for. He said he and some of his buddies went to some of these homes. They set a fire to the homes. If any Black person ran out, they hit him in the head with a club and they throw them back into the fire. So that was his account. So he was one of the rioters. But there's some, in the memoirs, there's lots of stories about whites and Black helping each other. There's lots of white citizens in Springfield that actually housed African Americans in their homes. Some of them were strangers to them. Some of them were their neighbors. Some of them were they were their employees. But there was lots of a lot of people, lots of whites and others helped to shelter African Americans. And there's lots of those stories in those oral history reports, interviews. And then one of the next thing that helped to break some of the silence was James Crowley. He was actually a student of Colum Davis, and he would do some of the interviews. Well, he gathered enough, he did a lot of research and he put together a little booklet. It's actually, it's a book, but it's more in, but he said it was more like a pamphlet. Um, and it's really small, but it has a lot of details in it. And so that really helped to tell more about what happened. But these memoirs and James Croy's book, and that was in 1973, was placed on a shelf for about 20 years. Very few people went to those books and very few people knew about those memoirs. So it was this, there was some silence broken, but it still was a little hush hush. And then in 1990, a lady by the name of Roberta Sichel de la Roche, she wrote a book on the race riot, and it's a wonderful book. She did lots of research. She has statistics on the population of Springfield, jobs that African Americans held, other riots that happened throughout our country during that time, as well as before that and after. She just gave lots and lots of detail about what happened, the people, the key figures during the race riot. That's a wonderful book. So that really helped to break some of that silence. So it's really beginning to open up and be talked about. And that was in 1990. The following year, there was two young ladies, two sixth graders, and they really broke the silence. One was named Lindsay Harney. The other young lady's name was Amanda Stobbs. Two sixth graders, 12, 13-year-old young ladies, and they did an exhibit on the 1908 race riot for the Illinois history exhibition. And I don't know if, I don't know how they fared for the contest, but after the contest ended, they had done all this wonderful work. They petitioned the city of Springfield to commemorate the 1908 race riot. And because of these two young ladies, these two sixth graders, that's why we have the markers. When they presented this to Mayor Ozzie Langfelder and the other city council people, they said they were scared. Taking this information to them, their children, and will they listen to them? So they had fears as well. The fear of talking about something that's so horrible. They had a fear about that. But they didn't let that fear stop them. They went ahead and presented their case, their petition, and it was 200 names on this petition. Most of them were their classmates, and the city listened. So 1994, 8 markers were placed because of these two young ladies. And so the silence began to be broken even more. But it still was kind of whispers. And at the time, those whispers in the began to increase. So the we can hear the silence wasn't so silence was being broken. So we have about 2008. I'm going to go. Well, during that time, during these whispers and louder voices about the race riot. So like doing African American History Month, it's still like a footnote for doing African American History Month and doing and for the anniversary. So you would hear about it in the newspaper during those times, but it really at the 100th anniversary of the race riot, things by that time had really taken off, and more people knew about the race riot, and were talking about it, especially in scholarly areas. So during the 100th anniversary, there was commemorations, lots of talks, and different things like that. People were really beginning to talk. 2009, the year, group of ministers deemed 2009 to be the year of reconciliation. And I really find that interesting. There was a group of ministers, because during the 1908 race riot, a group of ministers did denounce the riot. However, they blamed African Americans for the riot. So to have a group of ministers come together and call that year reconciliation, to me, it just means a lot. And that same year, they revealed a statue by a sculpture by Preston Jackson, and I have a picture at the end, near the end, that I'll show you of that. The silence is still being broken. About 2015, HighSpeed Rail comes along, and we really began to talk about it. That's federal grounds. So before anything, if something significant happened on those grounds, they had to do some excavations before they can begin to the work for the high-speed rail. So that's what happened here. They found some of the remains of some of the charred homes. I know in one of the homes they found a dresser, and it was charred. When they opened the drawers, they found, linens, some bed clothing, other belongings of the people that ran to get away from all the horrific stuff that was going on. So they found lots of artifacts at that time. 2018, we got new markers. The markers that was placed in 1994 were kind of tattered, and people just kind of, they just kind of blended in with the environment, the atmosphere, and people were just ignoring those things. So right now we're doing lots to commemorate the race riot so that silence can continue to be broken. I did help develop a portion of the walk, hike, and bike, and that was on the race ride. So I did a walking tour, and they do plan on doing that again this year. So if you get the chance, you can do, walk, hike, and bike. And there's some other ones too, but there's lots of things that are going on to commemorate the race riot. The Illinois State Museum. So the high-speed rail, one of the things that they're doing is going to have a transportation center, and in that transportation center, they are going to have an area that has exhibits that talks about the race riot. And the state of Illinois, the Illinois State Museum has been tasked with developing and presenting an exhibit area that will help tell that story about the 1908 race riot. And it's a community-centered approach that the Illinois State Museum is going with. We don't want to just do it alone. They're looking to have the community, all the community, help us. However, primarily, African Americans will help to tell this story. Approaching the project with active listening, collaborative power, and grace is what we're hoping to, that's how we are approaching this. So before I conclude, I would like to show you, I'm going to share my screen once again. Give me a second. Oh, I need to do. Okay, this is what I want to show you. My gosh. Okay, acts of intolerance. And this is a statue by Preston Jackson. And I used to work at the African American History Museum here in Springfield. I was able to talk to Mr. Jackson, and he gave me more information about these sculptures. I've always loved them. This was the sculptures that was placed also on 6th Street, right there in front of the Presidential Museum, and it was placed in 2009. He used that very last picture that I showed you about the aftermath, after all the homes were burnt, the ruins of the race riot. He used that as his focal point. And it's so much in, he infused so much into these statues. You can, it's like you could see so much, and it's really, it's move. It seems like it moves because you have to walk around it, but you can see African Americans with their children, with their pets, with their small amount of belongings, and it looks like they're running to the train station to get away from all this horrific stuff. You can see the car, the tangled car. You can almost, to me, the chimneys, you can almost see the smoke bellowing from the chimneys. So if you get the chance, definitely take a look at that. So this is pretty much the end of my presentation, but and I'm so happy that I was able to talk to you all tonight about it. And the silence is, it continues to, we're continuing to break that silence. So there's so in it, because the more we learn about the race riot, the more we can talk about it. And that's through research and talking to each other, having conversations about what happened, helps us reconcile, helps us to understand each other better, and to just, do more to help our country with, getting to that, making it, becoming a more perfect union. And it's not just a national thing, but a global thing. So we talk about these things more when we begin to understand each other better. So thank you very much. And I'll take questions at this time.
Thanks so much, Doris. There are lots of people expressing their thanks in the chat as well. If anyone has questions, you can put those in the chat or in the Q&A. There is a question that came into the Q&A from Carl. He asked, 1908 race riots. Why is this event still referred to as a race riot when in fact it was a vigilante justice and organized terror against the Black community?
Yeah, lots of people would like to see it referred to as a massacre, using different terms to describe it. I agree, because riot implies there was a groups were equally, yoked. Blacks are fighting against whites and whites against blacks. So it was a massacre, but that's the term that is still quite often used here. But I do, it was a massacre. So, and, it should be changed. And I'm not opposed to that term, changing the terminology.
Yeah. I was wondering, are all of those oral histories publicly available online?
Yes, University of Illinois transcribed them, and they are on their website, and you can read them from the beginning to the end. Yeah, yep, they're all there. So
Great.
they've all been transcribed. If you wanted to hear the voices, they also have the actual they interviewed them, so they have audio. But if you wanted, you can read the transcripts.
Wonderful. Someone, Denise was asking, what happened to the woman who started it, and how did it come out that that it was a lie, or how did she confess?
So Mabel Hellam was she actually was given a physical exam, and after doing that exam, they found that she had a venereal disease. They did the same exam on George Richardson. He had no disease. And then she was also on the grand jury, and she confessed at that time, while on the grand jury, that that George Richardson had not raped nor attacked her. But after getting off the jury, she went on to say that there was someone else. It wasn't him, but there was someone else. And she filed another affidavit against another man. But the sheriff's office, the judicial system realized that she lied. So for a couple of reasons. So she had an exam, found if George Richardson was the person that raped and attacked her, he'd have that same disease that she had. And then she confessed on the stand that she lied, but the transcripts from grand jury, they no longer exist. At least I haven't found.
Interesting. So another question from Kevia, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing names, everyone. You had mentioned there were some pastors early on that that thought that African Americans started the race riot or were propagating that. Weren't they aware of Mabel Hallam's confession, and how did they think that Blacks started it?
They believe that the northeast side of town where African Americans lived, and that was called the Badlands. The neighborhood where the businesses were, and that was called the Levee. And in those neighborhoods, there was some crime going on. So they believe that because of all the crime and immoral activities, those things are what caused the riot. You know, you're behaving badly, so you brought this upon yourself. But in the neighborhoods that they're talking about, so African Americans were restricted to certain parts of town. Now, African Americans did live all over Springfield, but they were primarily on the northeast side or the southeast side, and there was some scattered throughout Springfield. But you weren't going into Hawthorne. There was a couple people. William Florville Jr. He actually purchased a home in 1907. He's African American, and the white citizens of town had a fit that they're coming into our neighborhood. They were upset that he had purchased a home in their neighborhood. But Blacks lived all over Springfield. But on the northeast side, there was lots of it was a poor neighborhood, but not all Blacks were poor, but there was some stuff going on. You know, there was crime. There was some shanty-like homes, but there was also some Victorian homes, some Queen Anne homes in that, in all the midst of that. African Americans were striving to better, it's only 43 years after the slavery system ended that, and some of the rioters were still upset about the slave, Lincoln brought them here and we're going to get rid of them. They're still upset about that, so there's just, the neighborhoods were, they were doing okay, but they were working their way up to, they were prospering, but, at a slower pace than whites.
So one of the questions was, where are the discovered artifacts from that railway project excavation?
Okay. I believe that we're housing, the state of Illinois is housing some of those things here. So in a safe and secure location.
Yes, I believe they came into our collection,
yes.
as much of things excavated during such projects do come into to our collection. So let's see. We had a question from John asking about how, today a lot of violence typically occurs between identity groups. He says, beyond the 1908 race riots, do you know either statistics or other examples of Black on white crime and vice versa, or racially charged crime? Basically, I think he's asking, was it just Springfield, or was this happening in other places as well?
Definitely in other places as well. It wasn't just a Southern thing. There's lots of so 1908, there were 100 riots. There was 100 lynchings. There were 21 lynchings in Texas. There were 16 in Mississippi. There were about 12 in Alabama. Georgia had a certain amount, but and there's lots of other places as well, but there was about 100 race riots that year, or lynchings that year. And some of them were riots as well. So these things were, this was a, lynchings were sometimes like baseball games or picnics. It was a quintessential pastime of America for whites. So they were happening all over the place. I'm not sure exactly why this one. I think that the reason why this one happened, not happened, but stood out, is because it was in Lincoln's hometown and it was in a northern state. Many of the other race riots happened, or lynchings happened in the southern states. So this one stood out because it was in the north and it was in Lincoln's hometown. But there was lots of occurrences, and I can't put my finger on one in particular, but there were lots of them. This happened in 1908. In 1919, there was the Red Summer, and there was over 25 riots during that year. So it wasn't just Springfield, there was other stuff going on as well.
Tony asks, you mentioned that part of the reason why the NAACP was formed is this riot. Was the NAACP also silent about the riot, or were they doing work to keep the memory of this as well?
So the NAACP was formed 1909. The NAACP in Springfield. So the NAACP was formed in New York, and it was, working towards gaining civil rights for African Americans, and they did help, bring the riots. I did have a picture of outside the headquarters in New York. They used to hang a sign, a flag, and it said, "A man was lynched yesterday," or and that was quite popular flag that they would hang outside. So they were active in trying to. They actually had a bill. I think it was in about 1912 to 15 or something like that. They asked to have a bill. There was, oh gosh, I can't think of how many bills were put on the table for against lynch, a lynch law bill. There are several of them. I can't think of the number, but the NAACP was acting, trying to pass a lynching bill. So they were very much involved. The NAACP here in Springfield was not formed until 1915, and they were always trying to better our community from the moment they started.
Barbara asked, did the race riot set the stage for increased segregation and oppression against minorities in Springfield?
This one in particular?
Yes.
Okay. Did it ask that question once again? I want to.
Yeah. So did this riot set the stage for increased segregation and oppression against minorities in Springfield?
Okay. I think in some ways it may have. There's already segregation. Springfield wasn't, it was segregated. There was lots of restaurants, lots of businesses that did not patronize African Americans. There was, you could stay in a certain neighborhood if you had there was restrictions in the covenants for that's how some of the covenants for homeowners associations had covenants that restricted African American, the sale to African Americans. So Springfield, I don't know if it I don't know if it increased or made segregation more increase the segregation that was going on in Springfield. And I think I did say it did, but I'm not sure if it did. I think it just didn't change. I think it was already segregation here, and it just continued. I don't think it may have went up a bit, but I'm not sure. I don't have the statistics to tell you whether it went up or down. But Springfield was a segregated community. Lots of African Americans held some of the poorest of jobs. You know, if you had your own business, and there was lots of African American businesses here, that was a way for them to prosper. They would cater to their own people, and some of them had wealth from that. So there's still lots of segregation. And actually, Harry Loper. So I found, so I think of Harry Loper as a good Samaritan. And I heard some people say that he wasn't such a good Samaritan because he did not allow African Americans to patronize his business. However, I know on August the 14th, Harry Loper, the restaurant owner, was a good Samaritan. But his restaurant, I found for a long time, I didn't know for sure, but in the last couple of years, I found through the Forum newspaper, they would actually they had a list of businesses that did not patronize African American business. Harry Loper was on that list.
Well, thank you so much, Doris, for this presentation. Again, lots of people in the chat mentioned how grateful they were to you for this presentation. We really appreciate you doing this for us tonight. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight.